I'm going to start what is a multi-part series of lectures. You can jump in or jump out as you need to. I recommend going through all of them, but they're chunked. So to show you what I mean, there is an entire series. I've called it Today's Agenda. It covers issues like ideology, why do dominant ideologies persist, and you can see there's a number of possibilities that you might use to answer that question, and then the question, are there ways to resist dominant ideologies? So before we get to any of those later questions, though, we definitely want to take on the first, which is the question, what is ideology? So this particular lecture focuses on the concept of ideology and two terms that were developed by Karl Marx to consider ideology, which is the notion of base and the notion of superstructure. And if those terms confuse you, not to worry, because that's what we're doing today. Okay, so let's talk about what an ideology is. So an ideology is simply a belief. It's a belief about the way something is, or the way something was, or the way something will be, or should be, or shouldn't be. You can see there's a lot of different ways you can configure this, but at the root, we're talking about a belief. The important thing to understand about beliefs when we talk about politics, when we talk about marketing, when we talk about desire, is that a belief is always abstract. It feels real because it becomes real through embodied rituals. So, for instance, we might have an ideological structure about what romance should be, or what a real wedding is, or what true love is, or what it isn't. And we participate in particular kinds of rituals that tend to solidify that ideological structure, kind of ossify it, and make us feel like it's second nature. An important thing for us to understand about the notion of ideology is there's more than one flavor. And when we talk about power and ideology, or money and ideology, or desire and ideology, we tend to talk in terms of dominance and subdominance or counter-dominance. So let's talk about the notion of dominance first. So a dominant ideology is a belief that is favorable to the ruling class of any given society and presented as natural, normal, and common sense, and held by the majority of the people in an environment. So it's usually those three things. It favors the people in charge, it's presented as something that's just the way it is, and it tends to be believed by most of the people in a particular society, whether or not, and this is important, that belief is serving them in their everyday lives. Okay? So here's a question, and it is this. If the workers have always outnumbered the owners, and the poor have always outnumbered the rich, why do ideologies of the ruling class continue to remain dominant? So another way to put that is, if there's more folks who are being held down by particular kinds of ideological constructions, then why don't we just change the ideology? So this is probably the main question that preoccupied Karl Marx, right? So let's talk a little bit about Marx. So he, I think you all know, was German. He lived around the time that saw things like the U.S. Civil War, okay? If you can think of how manufacturing was working during that time, it sort of sets you up in your head for the kinds of conditions he was thinking about. He was largely ignored in his own time and only became popular after he died. And here are some of the more famous books that he's written. So Marx's big answer to the question is that the ruling classes have ideological dominance because base controls superstructure. So there's a bunch of jargon. So let's take a second and unpack that. For Marx, base equals stuff and people. So stuff he called the means of production. Land or factories or machines or tools or infrastructures, the stuff that you need to make commodity, or even to make things like food, things that you need to live. The relations of production are the ways in which labor is configured. So are you a slave? Are you a peasant? Are you a worker? Are you an owner? Each one of those positions changes what happens to you as a result of production moving forward, right? So you need both things. You need the means and you need the relations. He called that base, okay? Next bit. Superstructure for Marx is culture. So examples would be things like our legal systems or our political systems or our schools or religions or art or media. I have no idea why I put the Mona Lisa next to 50 Cent, but maybe because I thought it was hilarious that, his name is 50 Cent. So, and we were talking about Marx. So, base and superstructure are related, deeply related for Marx. Now, this is important because we usually think that our ideological beliefs come from our superstructure, our schools and our religions and our art and families. We normally don't think that they come from things like the stuff that people own to make the engines of capital move around, or even our position as laborers or owners or whatnot. But for Marx, the connection between base and superstructure is very important. So this isn't my picture, and I should have given some credit. The argument is base controls superstructure. So you can see base is the relations of production, right? And the means of production. And that's kind of like the basement of the house. And then on top of that, everything that has to do with life outside production is the superstructure. So everything that we would consider to be life outside of going to work, right? Our leisure time, our family time, our time to learn, our time to grow, our time to make art, etc. Base controls superstructure. So let's get some examples of how that works. So the next few slides are from a larger infographic that was made in 2011 by this blogger site called The Frugal Dad. In spite of the goofy name, it's actually a really nice infographic. And I've got the URL here. And it's about the concept of media consolidation. So one of the big organizing principles of media at the ideological level, especially with the rise of digital, is the idea of choice. So you can see almost consistently internationally, people when asked will say that it is a belief of theirs that they should be able to access anything that's out there in the world if there's a technological way to make that happen. This is actually something that you can see in a lot of surveys that have gone on in the last decade. But so that would be called kind of an ideological position relative to superstructure, right? Everybody wants content. But underneath that, the base, the mechanisms by which the content is provided, that becomes a bit of an illusion of choice because, as the slide here says, media has never been more consolidated. There are 6 media giants now controlling a staggering 90% of what we read or watch or listen to. So in 1983, 90% of American media was owned by 50 companies. In 83, 50 companies. And by 2011, that turned into 6. So what does that do to choice? Well, we're going to look into that. So Marx says base controls superstructure. And importantly for him, superstructure exists to legitimize base. So it doesn't exist to, our culture doesn't exist to give us new ideas or teach us how to be engaged citizens outside of the workforce. What it does is serve the needs of whoever owns the base. So again, here are some examples. So here are some 6 companies that own contemporary media. We've got GE, we've got News Corp, we've got Disney, Viacom, Time Warner, and CBS. And 232 media executives across those companies control the information diet of 277 million Americans. So you've got 232 people controlling what 277 million Americans are accessing. And you can see that's one media exec to 850,000 subscribers. And that's roughly, again, just for a sense of scope, that's one person controlling an area that's roughly the size of San Francisco. And this isn't just at the level of things like television, because as you know, because of media convergence, you have all of these overlaps, and one company is buying another. So here's an example of that. In the scenario at the left, I think it's your left, Clear Channel is the owner, okay? Clear Channel owns 1,200 radio stations, even though the FCC has forbidden companies to own over 40 stations. Nobody really understands how Clear Channel gets to own 1,200. Well, we do. They have subsidiaries. And it says things like, in Mino, North Dakota, they own every station, so you don't even get another choice. So say a company like Clear Channel owns 1,200 stations, right? And everywhere else in the United States, 80% of stations' playlists match, okay? So that's 32 years of back-to-back nonstop play. What that means is each one of these companies tries to make their playlist consistent, and the playlists then play all over the country. And what you wind up getting is the same songs again and again. And instead of saying, oh, well, these are the songs in our playlist and we're not changing it up because it's too time or money or copyright consuming for us to do that, they frame what's happening as classic hits, right? Now, another way that base controls superstructure is not just sort of through soft ideological positions like what constitutes a hit, but by old-fashioned ideas about ideology as hard power. And this is a kind of a neat example of how Chinese investment in Hollywood films is continuing to grow. And I thought I would let you watch that for a second.
Fact, if you go to a movie theater right now, there's a pretty decent chance you're going to be seeing a Hollywood movie with a budget partly from China. That is actually true of 2 of the top 3 movies out right now, and it's just one sign of a global power shift in entertainment that's already changing the movies you see. If you saw Disney's Iron Man 3 in American theaters, you might not remember this scene. That's product placement for Yili brand Chinese milk. And that's Chinese superstar Fan Bingbing. This entire plotline, where Iron Man is saved by Chinese doctors, was added just for China, where the movie broke box office records.
The evolution of the Chinese industry is happening at hyperspeed.
Didi Nickerson is a veteran producer who runs Infinity Pictures in Beijing, capitalizing on a boom that experts project will soon make China the world's biggest movie market.
There's still 8 to 7 new screens a day.
A day?
A day. the consumption of content has exploded.
The latest Transformers and Fast and the Furious movies both made more money in China than in the US. But the China effect isn't just about audiences.
China owns a significant portion of Hollywood output. So Universal has a co-financing deal, Paramount, Lionsgate, Fox. It's not $20 million, it's not $50 million, it's hundreds of millions of dollars in each of these deals.
China's quota system only allows a limited number of Hollywood releases, leading to a race to make movies China-friendly and appease state censors.
We convinced an entire generation.
That's Hong Kong pop star Angela Baby in Independence Day Resurgence, which featured China and the US teaming up to combat aliens.
You are in a part of the country no longer controlled by the government of the United States.
The 2012 remake of Red Dawn was re-edited to make its enemies North Korean, not Chinese. And this scene in Men in Black 3, which featured Chinese enemies, was removed from the Chinese release.
Censorship is still an issue. 15 years ago, when movies like 7 Years in Tibet or Kundun were being made, you wouldn't see studios making movies like that today.
That's a shocking statement.
But it's a true statement, and in fact, even in a lot of the co-financing arrangements between China and the United States, there's language in the agreements that the studios will not make movies that would be considered to be offensive to China.
Nickerson says there are now fewer cuts to U.S. films because movies are being created with China in mind from the beginning.
You can see so many things that just doesn't work. The Chinese people saving Iron Man. I mean...
You thought that was forced?
Right. It's screaming China become a very powerful country that can help Iron Man get back on his feet.
Mo Zhang is the daughter of Zhang Yimou, the director of The Great Wall, sometimes called China's Steven Spielberg. Last year, she directed a Chinese-language hit called Suddenly 17.
All the studio now has a piece of Chinese money, and therefore they probably have some Chinese CEOs or big boss sitting in the office. So that means it'd be easier maybe for Chinese young filmmakers like me to cross over.
And it sounds like a new wave of co-financing deals should make that a reality for her generation of Chinese filmmakers.
I'm so excited that we can work together.
This past fall, Steven Spielberg's Amblin Entertainment signed a co-production partnership with Chinese corporate giant Alibaba.
I don't think it's about censorship. It's all about respecting the different cultures and rules in each country.
Gao Zhaosong, the chair of Alibaba Entertainment's strategic committee, says to get used to China's growing role in Hollywood.
I don't think American audience care about where the money comes from. There are a lot of deals on the way. We'll be way more and faster than anybody can imagine.
The studios we reached out to did not comment. We are so used to an America-centric worldview in our movies, but you guys, it's very possible our kids are going to grow up with a different kind of cultural influence.
It's really fascinating. Right?
Yeah, you look, it's a seismic shift, and I think it's a microcosm for what's happening in the world powers in general, economically, politically.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks, guys.
I want to end here by pointing out that obviously the U.S. is just as engaged in ideological battles through their companies as any other country is. It's just that we in the U.S. often take certain positions entirely for granted, and it makes it more difficult to see until they're challenged. So an interesting example of this would be the right to be forgotten case, which came up in the European courts around Google's pretty serious lockdown on search data at this point. So there's a terrific podcast called The Nerd Writer that you can watch. Forgot what I was going to say. There's a terrific podcast called the Nerd Writer. I love it. I watch it all the time, and I'm going to have you watch a little bit of it so you can get a sense of what happened in that case.
1998, the Spanish newspaper La Vanguardia published a local announcement about the forced sale of a home due to outstanding Social Security debts. The property and the debts belonged to a Spanish lawyer named Mario Costeja Gonzalez. In 2009, 11 years later, Gonzalez didn't appreciate that even then, when you searched his name on Google, what you saw at the top of the results was this small financial lapse from the late 90s. Didn't he have a right for that information to be lost? Gonzalez contacted La Vanguardia and asked for them to take the story down. They said no, so he filed a complaint with the Spanish Data Protection Agency asking for the paper to remove the story and also for Google to do the same from its search engines. The agency director rejected the request to the newspaper, but upheld the one to Google, telling them to remove the links and make access to that data impossible. After some wrangling and appeals, the highest court in the European Union supported the agency director's demand, saying that Google was responsible for the processing of personal data and that people had a right to erasure or a right to be forgotten. So what's your instinctive reaction to this? Maybe you feel a strong sympathy for decent people who are just trying to get out from under the shadow of the World Wide Web, who want their pasts to be private. On the other hand, do we want business people handling our money, for example, to be able to erase a prior bankruptcy, or a politician to delete some troubling behavior from the past? The problem with the EU court's ruling is that the boundaries for lodging a complaint are so incredibly vague and open to interpretation. The court only says that information which is no longer relevant or timely can be erased, but who gets to decide that? American legal scholars are confident that such a law would not be passed in the States, where free speech protected by the First Amendment is championed more readily than each individual's right to privacy, though both are precious to us. A recent Pew study found that 68% of American internet users believe current laws are not good enough in protecting people's privacy online, and 86% have taken steps to mask their digital footprint. Privacy is not a word that appears in the US Constitution. The right to privacy is a relatively recent concept introduced by Louis Brandeis in an essay in the Harvard Law Review from 1890. This question is really hard to work out. What effects do my demands to have this picture of me doing a keg stand taken off some random blog have on an open and free internet? It's not readily apparent, but when Google or Facebook are burdened with that choice at the peril of fines or worse, then the path of least resistance may be to say, just take it down. And I think we can all see the slippery slope in that. In the description under works cited, I'll leave links to educated opinions on both sides.
That'll be it for this section, and there's more to come in the next section. Okay? Thanks for watching.